Audio Jungle.
I am the Divine Prince, Ty Emmecca, Pan-African Spiritualist, Practitioner, Author, Advisor, Elagoon, Oloye, Hoodoo, Obeya, Bokur. I reside in this beautiful and legendary, historic Treme, New Orleans, Louisiana. So join me as I share food, music, culture, tradition, the rhythms, and the flavor of New Orleans voodoo. Respect the voodoo. Honor and respect, honor and respect, honor and respect. Greetings and salutations, one and all, divine, all blessed, peace and love, joy and prosperity. It is another edition of Revolutionary Hoodoo, New Orleans Voodoo Secrets and Recipes. Can you hear me? Am I coming through clearly?
Yes, I can hear you.
All is a blessing. All is a blessing. We certainly appreciate your continued support and attention to our International New Orleans Voodoo Day, our third annual International New Orleans Voodoo Day. Please continue to visit our website at www.voodooday.org, www.vodouday.org for more information and updates about our coming third annual International New Orleans Voodoo Day. I also want to quickly introduce my host and co-host while we then move forward with a 40-minute documentary. 40-minute documentary. So gather your coffee, your tea, your cocktail, what have you, your munchy crunchies that you use, gather when you, are watching a documentary or watching a movie, your notepad certainly, and join us, and we will then discuss it on tomorrow night and in coming podcasts. So I certainly am grateful for my live participants in the chat. Imani Sankofa, greetings and salutations to you and yours, beloved. My co-host, my partner, my wild man, my first priest, Joshua Nylan Tanner. Thank you so much for sharing and caring and being present with us. Our elder and team member for NOIVD, financial advisor, Elder Green Soap. Certainly we appreciate you and your continued support. And my queen mother, Sister Toni Val Martinez. We certainly appreciate each and every one of you. Please offer your quick greetings and salutations, and then we will move right into this 40-minute documentary on hoodoo, voodoo, root work, conjure, the enslavement of Black people, and the occult. And the occult should be followed by white people in parentheses and their usage of the occult to enslave us, mind, body, and spirit. It is a social media documentary, but a one that I thought of value to bring to this space. So come on in, Joshua, Elder Reggie, Toni Val, and then we'll get into the documentary.
Hello, everyone out there. This is Toni Val. So happy you all could join us. Hello, Elder Reggie, Joshua. Yes. I'm curious to see this documentary.
Yes, I'm with you, Sister Toni. Peace, blessings, divine, Josh. As we move forward with the documentary, I got my notepad ready. Take some notes so tomorrow we get to discuss it, and we building bricks on brick, layer on top of layer as we move forward. So I'm here and I'm ready.
Likewise, it's Joshua. I'm glad to be here and ready for this documentary to begin our journey of understanding deeper the beautiful nuances of of the culture.
I'm with you.
And whenever you're ready, Divine, we can go ahead and we can start up that documentary.
Today, we're going to be discussing the enslavement of Black people, and also we're going to be discussing the occult. And now you might be thinking at the start that this sounds like a very strange video. How could you combine the two subjects? Well, it turns out that when you look through history books and also check out several studies about the subjects, you will find that there is actually a correlation, because there was in fact occultism exhibited from the slaves, the slave masters, and also what the pro-slavery advocates would use to justify the enslavement of innocent Black people. And so you might be asking, what qualifies me to even make such a video? Well, I just so happen to be a descendant of a 17th century white German witch from Holland who married a Black slave and had multiple children with him. And so given my direct lineage to multiple lines of slavery, and given the fact that I'm probably one of the only people who can trace their lineage back to a literal urban legend who is known as the Witch of Block Island in Rhode Island, well, you have to admit there are very few people who will be more qualified than me to discuss this topic. So grab your favorite drink, kick back and relax, and let's discuss the curious tale of magical slaves, occultism in the slavery practice. Occultism, as defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is the theory or practice or belief in or study of the action or influence of supernatural or supernormal powers. And many things have been defined as occultism, from voodoo to Satanism, magic to demon summoning, astral projection, fortune telling, mysticism, shamanism, and other practices and beliefs. Generally speaking, occultism just falls outside of major belief practices. And there are double standards when it comes to labeling one practice or belief as occultism versus others. The word occult derives from the Latin word occultus, which means secret agency or hidden. And the suggestion is that if you utilize magic, or you know about esoteric knowledge and esoteric systems, shamanism, paganism, and any other type of occult knowledge, then what you are engaging in is secret or hidden knowledge that was not meant for human consumption, and certainly not for human utilization. But people don't understand the role that the transatlantic slave trade played in perpetuating the beliefs in witchcraft and also superstition that we still hold to this very day. For example, did you know that at one point the people who were enslavers were sometimes seen as witches themselves, or using some sort of evil magic? And this wasn't super common, but however, there was a flip side to this. In the early days in Europe, and also the lands that we call the United States today, if someone were to be labeled a witch, they could either be sold into slavery, or they could lose their life, or both. The other thing you may find interesting is that as more slaves arrived in the United States, we also saw a rise in the witch trials, where you had usually innocent women who were accused of being witches, and usually there was no way to get justice, because once you were accused by the right person, you were pretty much guilty. And once you were found guilty, you were then forced into servitude. And so the early 13 colonies saw a benefit in doing this. And so they pushed this idea that witches were everywhere. It is without doubt that slaves were pushed into Christianity. But wouldn't it be fascinating to know that because of the occult and certain themes, that the slaves got a copy of the Bible that didn't include all books, such as the Book of Enoch. And now the Book of Enoch is no longer in most Bibles. However, it did exist in the Holy Bible in its entirety during the time of the Salem witch trials, and also before then, and even afterwards. And so if this one book was excluded from the slaves because they didn't want slaves to read this, I think that is a very good thing to bring up in a video about slavery and the occult, don't you think? And while the original white slave owners were apprehensive to the idea of the occult, they did not outright reject the use of so-called magic among the slaves. And so I want to explore a little bit into what is defined as magic, because you may not realize it, but some of the everyday activities that you or someone that you may know engages in may have been considered to be heresy and or magic at one point. Like, for example, did you know that at one point, the blacksmith profession, you know, the idea of making swords and knives and shields and other items, that was considered to be magical in multiple cultures and in multiple continents. Or, for example, if someone was just exceptionally good in combat, they would oftentimes be portrayed as some type of deity, because you could certainly see how someone like, for example, Achilles may have been an actual real person, but because he was so good in combat, he was seen as a demigod, or even someone like Heracles or Hercules, as some people may call him. Even the idea of public speaking and convincing a large swath of people to do something may have been seen as a form of witchcraft. And I could use many other examples of this, but I'm not going to use an example from the transatlantic slave trade to explain what many people viewed as magic. Instead, I'm going to use what many people, especially the white enslavers at that time during the 16th and 17th and 18th century, believed to be magic and what they were basing their beliefs on. Now, later on in the video, I'm going to discuss a famed witch hunter from the 17th century known as Cotton Mather. And Cotton Mather, he was a very important man, and he wrote many things. He was a hardcore Puritan, but there are some other things that Cotton Mather wrote about, things that quite honestly demonstrates what many people of the time considered to be magic due to ignorance and the lack of research into the natural world and also natural cures and natural disasters. By the time of Cotton Mather's demise, many scholars had collected a series of writings that were supposed to be a part of the original Holy Bible. And these texts were known as the apocryphal texts, or what many of us in the occult would call the grand context of the Bible. So to explain what many people involved in the transatlantic slave trade believed to be magic at that time, and even before then, we must check out this dissertation that was written by Grace Sarah Harwood for Georgia State University, discussing Cotton Mather's commentary on the Synoptic Gospels, which means that Cotton Mather was well aware of the apocryphal texts. Even though they were completely compiled after he passed away, they were still being compiled when he was alive, which means that he would have known, or there was a high likelihood that he understood the story of Noah's Ark and the real reason why God flooded the entire earth. And in fact, I can prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt, because Cotton Mather was a Nephilim enthusiast, and the Nephilim is a very important thing, because the Nephilim are said to be half human, half angel hybrids that were created when God sent down these angels known as the Watchers, who were all led by an angel known as Samyaza. And so God's angels began teaching secret knowledge, or what many people would consider to be the occult, to humans. And some of the things that were taught were things like mathematics, science, history, how to work with the earth, you know, the early root workers, how to use medicinal cures. They were teaching women how to dress up to appeal to men, and other things that you would consider to be normal everyday activities right now. However, God considered those things to be forbidden, because many of those things were considered to be witchcraft or heresy. And the central figure of this whole story is not the leader of the Watchers, Samyaza. Instead, it was the then angel known as Azazel. And we get the popular term of scapegoat from Azazel, and I will explain how. Because Azazel, you see, he taught humanity the art of war and how to make weapons. And depending on the reading that you attain about the Watchers, Azazel either did or didn't have children with human brides. And so it makes it very interesting when God finds out about what the Watchers have done. God didn't punish Samyaza, the leader of the Watchers, the harshest. No, God punished actually Azazel. And it's not even clear if Azazel actually had children with the humans to make these giant human hybrids known as the Nephilim, who are still spoken about to this very day. But instead, God punished Azazel seemingly because Azazel gave humanity the means in which to resist God. And so if you were to read the apocryphal text, you would see that God said to all sin is ascribed to Azazel, not to Samyaza, who was the leader of the Watchers, but Azazel, because God apparently had a special hatred that was reserved just for Azazel, who, once again, I must say it for a third time, we aren't even sure made human and angel hybrids known as these dangerous monsters called the Nephilim. No, all God punished Azazel for with a surety is just teaching man the art of war, how to fight, how to defend yourself. Azazel was the ancient version of the Second Amendment. And so everything that was mentioned about Azazel and the Watchers, everything that was taught to humanity was something that Cotton Mather would have been aware of, because this man is being called America's first Nephilim enthusiast, which means he was the first guy and he understood the history of the Nephilim. So that is the context of Cotton Mather and his judgments of what he would consider to be magic. And you may be thinking, why am I talking about all this? Well, it's going to become very relevant later. And you might be asking, why did I go through all the trouble of speaking about the apocryphal texts? Well, the apocryphal texts were used to justify a lot of slavery and also colonization. And the way that I can prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt is that even Christopher Columbus read the second book of Esdras, which is a part of the apocryphal text. And it's quoted here from Christian History Institute that his sailing across the world was in part because of the second book of Esdras that says that God created the world in multiple parts, specifically 7, and that there was a water world, but also 6 dry lands. And so he used this calculation to try to find places. And so if it were not for the apocryphal text, Christopher Columbus and the Spaniards would have never colonized Hispaniola and other parts of the world.
Why did you wish to sail west?
To open a new route to Asia. Asia is the richest kingdom, the land of spices and gold. At the moment, there are only 2 ways of reaching it. By sea, sailing around the African continent, the journey takes a year, or by land. But the Turks have closed this route to all Christians. There is a third way. By sailing west across the ocean sea.
The distance is unknown. It's said to be infinite.
Superstition. I believe the Indies are no more than 750 leagues west of the Canary Islands.
And you be so certain?
The calculations of Toscanelli, Marin de Tir, Esdras.
Esdras is a Jew.
So what's worse?
2 minutes, and already you're a dead man.
And it's hard to talk about the apocryphal text with the Bible without discussing the curse of Ham, or the part of Genesis that supposedly justifies the enslavement of Africans. And in fact, you had Jewish, Christian, and also Muslim clergy members who utilized the curse of Ham to justify the enslavement of Black people. And this story is quite common, and we saw this throughout the world, because for going on 500 years, it was taught that Black people deserved to be enslaved because a Hebrew prophet condemned Black people who descended from Canaan, who was Ham's son. But I must say that when it comes to Islam, the Quran does not mention the curse of Ham, and the curse of Ham was eventually rejected by Islam before Judaism and also before Christianity. So Islam got this right where the other two got it wrong for so long. And in fact, some people, when they read the book of Genesis, several Jewish and Christian scholars suggested that Black people were predestined to be a slave race, and that by enslaving them, you were guiding them out of darkness. And so when I hear people of the Jewish faith make the claim that they never had slaves, well, that is absolutely a lie, because not only did you have slaves, you even justified it. And so we come to the point in the video in which we have to discuss some of the Black slaves and some of their beliefs in terms of religion. And I'm going to take this to levels that you may not have expected, because yes, we're going to discuss hoodoo in terms of the foundational Black American or freedmen religion that was created during slavery. However, before we get to that, we must discuss the reasons why Black slaves even developed religions in the first place and were so religious from the outset. There were already Black people in the Americas before the transatlantic slave trade, but for the ones that were taken from Africa, well, that continent in general has always been religious. And it's because of this that when you had white white supremacist enslavers showing up to the African continent and started enslaving people, as I mentioned before in the video towards the beginning, many of the black Africans interpreted these white enslavers as witches themselves because they were profiting off of the suffering of other human beings. And as I said before, back in the old days, what was considered witchcraft was a little bit more tame than what you see in Harry Potter or World of Warcraft or a video game or a movie or whatever you have out there that gives you your current mental image of a witch. No, back then, if you were to profit off of the mass suffering of a people and you did it for a prolonged period, then that was seen as a form of witchcraft. And if these white enslavers did not want to be labeled as witches, well, what doesn't help is that many of these stereotypes that are given to black people, even to the modern day, were actually true of the white people back then. Like, for example, there was this suggestion that black people used to eat other black people, but the truth is that white people during the transatlantic slave trade routinely ate their black slaves. And in fact, if you were to look at this writing from William D. Pearson that is entitled The Journal of Negro History, you will see that African slaves faced the horrors of becoming dinner because of the degeneracy of the white supremacists. And some of this stuff was seen as ritualistic because I want you to imagine that you're in a village and you suddenly see these white folks come in the night and come and snatch you up. And they get you on this ship with technology that you've never seen before. It seems almost like magic. And then they start eating you. Well, you would assume that these people weren't human, because what kind of a human would just enslave people, make them work until they pass away, and then if they got hungry enough, would eat them? And then those same white supremacists had the nerve to claim that it was the Africans who were the heathens and the barbarians. And in fact, many African slaves were so aware of the cannibalism by the white enslavers that many of them decided that the grave was a safer place than living amongst the enslaved. For example, in 1803, the Igbo people, who were known to be rebellious, did something that etched their names into the history books. Because in 1803, a group of Igbo people who were due to be slaves decided to jump from the slave ships. And this came after they took over that slave ship. And this happened on the Georgia coast. Those people were from Nigeria. And in terms of my own occultism, I have a tattoo of a sigil of an entity that I don't believe belongs to the Abrahamic faiths, but instead belongs to a Nigerian tribe that still exists to this very day. But more importantly, I come from this exact same line of people, or at least on one side anyways. And what they did was so iconic that not only do we have monuments that are underwater, but if you remember the Black Panther movie, the character Killmonger that was portrayed by Michael B. Jordan said something to T'Challa, who was the Black Panther as portrayed by Chadwick Boseman, when T'Challa wanted to save Killmonger. Well, Killmonger said this in terms of not being placed in a jail cell or in bondage. And he told T'Challa to bury him in the ocean with his ancestors because they knew that death was better than bondage. What Killmonger was talking about were the Igbo people, who in fact jumped from the slave ships. And you may think that's a very random thing to bring up in a video about slavery and the occult, but this leads into hoodoo and other practices, because many Black Americans, and especially those who are into the occult or occult practices or alternative religions outside of the Abrahamic religions, still believe that water and roots and dirt are the foundations of Black magic, or magic that is utilized by Black people. But I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. We have to understand the difference between hoodoo and voodoo at this point. And so hoodoo is seen as more of a folk magic, even though it is a religion. Whereas voodoo has a hierarchical priesthood and also involves worship of these entities known as the Loa. But with hoodoo, you have more of a focus on the natural world and natural cures, natural environments, but from a spiritual angle. And those hoodoo practices have been practiced alongside Christianity, which is why you find so many Black people in the South who claim to be super Christians, but when you talk to them about their daily activities, some of the hoodoo rituals, and some of the superstitions, you will find that these people are more like hoodoo people who just so happen to observe some Christian treats versus Christians who practice some hoodoo. Another big difference between hoodoo and voodoo is that hoodoo actually incorporates sometimes religious texts from other religions, and they will call on keynote figures from other religions as saints to assist them in their rituals and their practices. Whereas with voodoo, you once again have a written and clear hierarchical structure. And voodoo also has a one true God, a supreme creator known as Bonnier, which translates into good God or the good kind. And even some of the languages used were different. Like, for example, if you were to go down to South Carolina and talk to some of the hoodoo practitioners there, many of them will speak Gullah Geechee or the freedmen language known as Tut, and they will incorporate that into their religious practices. Whereas with voodoo, if you were to go over to Haiti, many voodoo services are conducted in French or some version of French like Creole. And also, unlike voodoo, in hoodoo, you can actually consider yourself to be a Christian who just so happens to believe in African gods such as the Orisha and also Jesus. And if for some reason you can't believe that a person can practice hoodoo while also being a Christian, well, I got some news for you. It is common in America to practice hoodoo while also being a Christian, and it has been common for hundreds of years. In fact, there are some practices in which when I mention them, some light bulbs will come on in your head because you'll recognize them. Like, for example, did you ever find it weird how in only the South, for the longest time, did you find this phenomenon of catching the Holy Ghost, or when someone proclaims to be caught up in the spirit and just starts falling out or doing backflips down a church aisle? Well, let me tell you, that is not linked to Christianity. No, instead, that is linked to hoodoo. And in fact, even some of the modern day methods of baptism is linked to hoodoo, especially in the Southern Baptist churches and even the white churches who copied the black churches. And then if you look at the ceremonies themselves, especially with the black church and the AME church or African Methodist Episcopal Church, you will find remnants of hoodoo everywhere. And the way that you know this is absolutely true is because many hoodoo practitioners actually use parts of the Bible in their daily practices. And so you had slaves who had this religion and they wanted to practice it. And so in an effort to hide it from the slave masters, they would combine it with Christianity, whereas you didn't have something like that with voodoo. Another big difference is that you can't just pass down magic from one generation to another in voodoo, but in hoodoo, that is actually a feature in that it is common for someone's ancestors to have practiced hoodoo, and that be the reason why the next generation practice hoodoo. And so basically hoodoo is more of an ancestral religion, and with some rituals, I can tell you from personal experience, you need the help of the ancestors, or else that ritual and whatever effect you're desiring to acquire will fail. But I have a much more simplistic and down-to-earth difference for you. Hoodoo more so focuses on the natural environment in terms of what you can generate, what you can conjure, what you can summon for protection, and more practical things that are more tactical use for everyday life. Because hoodoo was created by slaves during the transatlantic slave trade in the United States, and therefore the practice had to be practical. However, with voodoo, you see more of a spiritual angle. You don't see as much natural cures, ointments, and tinctures because you have an organized religious structure there, much like a church. And so you can do some of the same things in hoodoo as you do in voodoo and vice versa. However, the difference is like this. If you have scissors and a butter knife, sure, you could cut a piece of paper with a butter knife, but you would more easily cut it with scissors. And you can cut some butter with scissors, but butter knives are made to cut butter. So while one can do the other sometimes, one thing is meant for one thing and the other thing is meant for their thing, and you should never confuse the two. One of the other differences is terminology. In voodoo, once again, you have an organized religious structure, and in hoodoo, not so much for the most part. You have the concept of a voodoo priestess or priest, but in hoodoo, you have the concept of a root worker or conjure woman. And that term root work was used in English in the 1830s to describe black people, usually black men, who were root doctors that used traditional herbs, roots, and spells and potions and other things that are more associated with hoodoo than any other spirituality. And some of the the effects of root workers and conjure women can still be seen to this very day. And in fact, the traditional term for Black American medicine was called root work. And the reason why Black American women who were slaves were called conjure women is because hoodoo is a conjuring type of magic. Voodoo manipulates the natural world, whereas with hoodoo, you are supposed to create new things and conjure cures and conjure things for protection. And that sort of belief system lends itself to creativity, which explains why so many Black Americans to this very day, and especially the Black descendants of American slaves, are such a creative people. And that's because for centuries, being creative and making up things and conjuring things was how we survived. The history of root doctors within freedmen culture or Black descendant of American slave culture is both rich and, surprisingly to some, well documented. And if you were to go over to conjuredoctors.com, you can see some of them. Like, for example, you have Charles Harrison C.H. Mason, who was a pastor, but throughout his sermons and throughout his services, he would use roots to discern God's will, which, as you might imagine, is more linked to hoodoo. And then you had Ed Murphy, who was a Mississippi conjure doctor, who became famous for not only his superstitious beliefs and his occultism, but also for being a really good doctor. And then you have Jean Montigny, who was also known as Dr. Jean or Jean Bayou, and he was enslaved in Cuba. He became so famous with his fortune telling and his root work that he is considered the father of New Orleans voodoo. And then you have Dr. Jim Jordan, who was famous until his death in 1962, and he was famous for being a root doctor even until the 60s. And you have Black women such as Caroline Tracy Dye, but some may know her as Aunt Caroline Dye, who was not only known as a conjure woman, but just like my grandmother and my aunts, there were claims that she could see the future or see the past and could see things that she couldn't possibly have been able to naturally see. Or basically, like your grandmother said, if you're a Black person, she had the gift. You had Black Herman, who may have also been known as Benjamin Herman Rucker, who was actually one of the greatest illusionists in American history because of his street magic and also his sleight of hand tricks. But he also was a root worker as well, and he was born in the late 1800s, and he passed away in 1934. And then you have spiritual mother Maud Shannon, who was the spiritual mother of the Spiritual Church of New Orleans. And now many Black people don't realize that when Black churches call their eldest women mother, that this is actually paying homage to hoodoo. And you may have heard of this next woman. Her name is Harriet Tubman, and I think that her name needs no introduction. She is one of the greatest freedom fighters the world has ever known. But she was also a well-known and regarded conjure woman who was known to work with roots. And then you have Patsy Moses, who was born into slavery in Bend County in Texas. And it was well known that she was a conjure woman because she is known as Patsy Moses, the Texas conjure woman. And then you have people like Gullah Jack. And Gullah Jack was a Black man who would use his conjuring abilities and other parts of hoodoo to aid him in freeing Black people. And then you have people like Mary Allen Pleasant, who was not only a freedom fighter, but also an abolitionist and a Black woman who came into some money. And she also helped to run the Underground Railroad. And this woman is so revered and so respected that she is known as the mother of human rights in California. And this next woman is very, very important because she explains a very complicated concept that is true to American history. This woman's name is Emma Dupree. She passed away in 1995, which means that she was a root worker in the modern day. And Emma Dupree is known as a granny woman. And a granny woman was a woman that was known throughout the country as a woman who was good at being a midwife, good with herbal cures, good with making potions and tinctures. And basically, people who couldn't afford to go to the hospital or go see an actual doctor would call upon these granny women, who were usually women who also knew hoodoo, and they knew how to work with the roots and the plants and the earth in order to make what Miss Emma Dupree would call a garden-grown pharmacy. You have others like Marie Steele, who was a Black and Cherokee Indian woman, who was a well-noted and well-respected conjure woman. You have Aunt Sally from Gee's Bend, Alabama, who was not only one of the only midwives in the area, but she was the only medical personnel in the entire area. And the only medical expertise that she had was her root work. And you even have people who were unnamed, such as this Mississippi conjure doctor, who, like many in his time in 1926, were not respected because of their skin color, but were utilized because of their medical expertise. And the next part of this video is going to be contentious because I'm going to mention a slave who I believe to be black, but many other people describe as Native American, and I think those people are just engaging in bad faith arguments. This woman that I'm referring to is named Tituba, and Tituba was a slave that was brought from the Caribbean, and she was owned by a man named Samuel Parris, who was a minister in Massachusetts. And this woman was accused of witchcraft, and that one accusation would start off a chain of events that was referred to as the Salem witch trials. And when you read some of the information about Tituba, you will find what I describe as intentional omissions of some historical facts. If you were to check the Salem Witch Trials Museum, you will find out about two other women. And the story of these women is even more interesting because one was named Candy, and she was a black woman who was enslaved from Barbados. And she was owned by a white woman whose name is Margaret Hawks. And so that shows you that when you see the modern day white woman claim that she has somehow a comparable struggle to black people, well, I gotta ask the question, at what point was it legal for a black person to own a white woman, like white women own black people? And then you have the story of Mary Black, who was owned by a white man named Nathaniel Putnam, and she was accused of witchcraft in 1692. Tituba, the most important figure in the Salem witch trials, was indeed a black woman. And the people who don't understand this simply don't understand the history of how we classify people by race in this country, because it was very common in the early days, and especially the 16th and 17th century, to refer to people as either African or Indian based on just eyewitness testimony alone. Because if you were to read the backstory of Tituba, you would find out that even the famed witch hunter and Puritan Cotton Mather once described her as a slave from Africa. In fact, the early Puritans, they really had a different way of categorizing race, because they wouldn't just label someone as black just because their mother was black and their father was a native, and they would just go off of what they would perceive based on vision alone. However, if you look at the colonial references to Tituba, you would find out that this person practiced hoodoo, which is a practice that was created by black people during slavery in the United States. And just like this paper that was written in the year 2000 by Veda Smith Tucker from Grand Valley State University, you can see that there's been some grand attempt to erase the blackness right out of Tituba. And the fact is, her name, Tituba, is a name that is found in Nigeria. And that name comes from the Yoruba traditions, which is linked to popular deities such as Ogun, Anansi, Shango, Yemoja, and many others. So you have this woman who is practicing a religion that was made by black people in slavery, and she has a name that is still being used in Nigeria till this very day. And if you were to read the book written by Peter Charles Hoffer entitled The Devil's Disciples, Makers of the Salem Witchcraft Trials, that was published under the Johns Hopkins University Press, you would see that Tituba and her black origins are seemingly being covered up. And in fact, this guy appears to believe that Tituba wasn't Indian at all, that she was completely African. And we also find the evidence of the reasons why people thought that she was Indian. And it's the exact same thing that I was thinking when I was reading this, because I saw the last name of her husband. And so you see Tituba marry an Indian man, and his name was John Indian. And so when you marry a man, you take on his surname. And so when people who didn't understand the history or understand the history of her name coming from Nigeria, well, they assumed that she was an Indian. And that is despite all of the facts to the contrary, because at the very least, you would have to say that she's at least half African, because oftentimes when you had marry a black person who was a slave back in those days, what would happen is that person, especially if they were a woman, and especially if they might have had some racial ambiguity, would oftentimes be assumed to be the racial identity of their partner. And so as you see from the quote here, Tituba, just like many black women who were slaves who married people who were outside of their race, but also may have had some racial ambiguity, would be changed from African to Indian. And so this whole time, you had people out there trying to give the credit of suffering to other groups and trying to erase a historical figure despite all the evidence to the contrary. And if you need further evidence of this, well, I found a paper that was discussing the Arawaks and the Maroons. And the Arawak people are also known as the Tainos, who largely resided in the Caribbean islands. And while those people are not black, we find out that they had interactions with the Black Maroons. And if you don't know who the Black Maroons are, well, let me explain. You see, the Black Maroons were escaped slaves who started their own tribes and their own armies in both North and South America. And their whole goal was to live peacefully and or burn down slave plantations and free the slaves. Basically, these people were freedom fighters, and they were pivotal to some of the most important revolutions that we've seen in human history. Like, for example, you can see the occult influence that the Black Maroons already had due to many of their beliefs that were rooted in African religions. And then aside from that, we know that the Black Maroons interacted with the Haitians before and after the Haitian Revolution. And we all know of the occult practices from Voodoo and other beliefs that is located in Haiti. But that's besides the point. We know that the Black Maroons and the Arawak people actually intermingled and intermarried. And we know this because Christopher Columbus met the Arawak people in 1492. And then shortly afterwards, the Spanish ransacked their lands, and those lands included Caribbean islands, such as Hispaniola and also the Bahamas. And due to disease, enslavement, and even some of the Spanish taking the life of the Arawak people, many of them perished. And so when the numbers of the Arawak people were going down, the Spanish imported black slaves. And those same slaves, as I mentioned before, intermingled with the Arawak people. And it is for that reason that many of the Arawak people were classified as black or maroon, which was another way of saying black. So the idea that Tituba could not have been a black woman is not only ridiculous, but that suggestion in no way reflects historical reality. And so I called the Salem Witch Trials Museum. And when I tell you that that museum engaged in the concept of I'm white and I say so, I'm not kidding you, because even the so-called educational director sat there and told me this woman was Indian and there was no way she could have been African, and that they leaned more towards Indian. And that is despite the fact that Peter Charles Hoffer and other people have clearly pointed out that she is African. And like I told them on the phone, many black women who were slaves who married other people outside of their race would assume the racial category of their spouse, and especially if that person has racial ambiguity. And I was even told on the phone that it was uncommon for women to take the last names of their husband, and that's despite the fact that Peter Hoffer clearly says otherwise, because I'm going to quote right here. It says, quote, Tituba became Indian because her husband was Indian John. His identity became hers, just as women took their husbands' names and their husbands took married women's property. There were a number of such intermarriages in the 18th century in which racial identity shifted from African to Indian. Peter Hoffner is right, and I'm really, really concerned about the Salem Witch Trials Museum and their I'm white and I say so attitude, because it didn't matter what I said. It seems like the goalposts were being pushed further and further and further and further out, which explains why we have a really hard time in this country actually finding out accurate information, because people put their personal biases and their I'm white and I say so attitude before the facts and the evidence. Because one of the lines of slaves that I come from comes from Rhode Island, which is in the northeast part of the U.S. And I know for a fact that when I was told on the phone by the Salem Witch Trials Museum that it wasn't common for women, especially slave women, to take on the surnames of their husbands, well, I knew that was ridiculous, because my 8th great grandmother, who was a white woman, married into the Sands family, which is one of the most famous families in the whole northeastern part of the U.S., because from the 16th to the 18th century, the Sands family, Jefferson family, and Stilwell families had slaves who built up a good bit of the northeastern part of the United States. And so it is very insulting to have a white person lecture me about slave names when the fact is I have 5 different historical societies who have featured my lineage because I am so good at researching. And also when I talked to the Salem Witch Trials Museum, there was this suggestion that the reason why her race went from Indian to black is due to racism. Well, that's not true, because if you actually read the account of the famed witch hunter Cotton Mather, he said that while he was interrogating her, she transformed from African to Indian, which means that this early school racist literally changed this woman's racial identity. And the I'm white and I say so people at the Salem Witch Trials Museum is literally just going with that. And that's despite the fact that when you research the name Techuba, it comes from Nigeria. There is no current large swath of native women named Techuba. And the way that I'm going to pull rank on this is that I'm currently a practicing occultist who utilizes Ogun and also Anansi from the Yoruba traditions that comes from Africa. And I know that Techuba is a name that comes from those traditions. And if people claim otherwise, I'm going to call them racist. Because if you can't find a bunch of native women named Techuba right now, and yet you can find that in Nigeria, and then we see proof that Cotton Mather claimed that this woman used hoodoo with an African name, that at this point, if you're claiming that she's native, you're just engaging in I'm white and I say so, and you're also engaging in black erasure. Because when it comes to correcting the record, we know that those records were never corrected because white people wanted to correct them willingly. It's time to stop lying, and it's time to stop using other people to delegitimize black stories, and all because you want a connection to a story that is not yours.
ACAB, don't you step to ME. I run to your sundown towns, then turn them upside down. But some of y'all monsters like stranger things in the upside down. No surrender, no retreat, certified.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Mr. Toni, Elder Reggie, what you think?
Wow.
Oh, Divine, that had me captivated. Some of it was over my head, but I'm gonna unpack some of it between tonight and tomorrow. But I enjoyed every ounce of it. Some of it he was spot on. Some of it just was over my head.
That's why I can't be tamed. None of it was ever a game.
Yeah, that was amazing. I must say that was something wow. The detail and the in-depth study of that was spot on. Spot on.
Today we're going to be discussing the enslavement of black people, and also we're going to be discussing.
He was very enthusiastic about what he was teaching. A lot of it I knew from the Salem witch trials because I studied them. And I always knew that Tituba was a black woman and how she actually was lied upon at the start of the Salem witch trials. She did practice hoodoo because her accusers were the 4 young white teenagers would tell some of the things that she practiced, and she showed them. She did water divination. She read shells. She did root work, and she showed them. And they, of course, thought it was magic and labeled her witch. When they got caught doing something they wasn't supposed to be doing, they blamed her and said she made them do it. She enchanted them with a spell, and they wiggled around on the floor like they was catching epileptic seizures, saying she was hurting them, that she was doing it to them. So it's very interesting what he was saying. I took down some names that I'm gonna look into so that we can discuss tomorrow.
Yeah, likewise.
Yes, he brought up one topic that I see a lot on Instagram and on some of the YouTube channels where there's a big fight against black people who saying they're indigenous first, then they're Africans, and some of them are saying they're not Africans at all. He make mention of Africans being in the Americas when Christopher Columbus arrived. Now, there's a group of scholars saying that's just not true. They say what Ivan Van Sertima put that out there first, that was debunked. I really would like to get to the nitty gritty of that at some point as we continue to unpack and research.
Likewise, I'll be willing to chime in on that. Definitely, that is definitely something I'm pretty versed in. It's very interesting. The nuances, though.
Go ahead.
The nuances in that in that documentary was very spot on. Like, it really was talking about the mixing of names and people taking names and not taking names, specifically women. Yeah, it was played politically for the advantage that they needed to take advantage of during that time. And the context of that has changed through time so much. And it's man, I'm still digesting that documentary. That documentary was spot on.
But Joshua, a question I have: prior to 1492, whenever Christopher Columbus got here, were there Africans on the American soil?
At that time, they were long removed from Africa. You have to remember, the continents were once connected. There was a land bridge that connected Africa to the Americas, and they literally walked, migrated here long before Christopher Columbus, and they were already here indigenously.
Yeah.
So you can say that there were Africans here already, and you could tell from their ancient stories that they knew about the flood, that we know about Noah. They knew about a lot of stories, and they knew about a lot of things that happened in people from ancient Africa that was in their stories and in their drawings and in their art.
Yeah.
That they did indeed have a connection to Africa, and in some of their ways and in their medicine ways, they still held over a lot of African traditions.
Yeah.
That they probably, just like we don't realize why we do things, they probably had forgotten why they did these things. But this land was one landmass at one time before the continents broke up. And if all life started in Africa at a certain time, yes, those African people did migrate here looking for whatever people go looking for, like Christopher Columbus. If you go back and read the description that the early explorers gave of the people they came in contact with, you will hear them say dark skinned, woolly hair, straight hair. You know, it all depends on what region they went to.
Yeah.
Even all those little Caribbean islands were once a part of the mainland. Look how close Cuba is to us.
Yeah.
It just broke off and got pushed off over hundreds of years. So you had people that came from Africa that got cut off in Cuba when the land bridges, when they could no longer walk from place to place.
In the West Indies too.
Yes.
Virgin Islands. Yeah.
So you look at all them little islands, if you was to get a map and cut them into pieces, you would have a puzzle where you could find how they connect together back to the mainland that we call America, back to the mainlands, the other continents, England and Africa. So
Sister,
yes, there
but
were Africans here.
Sister Toni, with all due respect, Brother Joshua, with all due respect, the research just don't bear that out. I know it feels good, it sounds good. The research don't bear that out that the Africans were here when Christopher Columbus got here. The people that was here migrated through the Barren Straits and came and repopulated this land. When they're finding the bones, they're finding the skulls, they're not finding African DNA in these older bones. They are finding. This is not what Reggie is saying. This is what the research, because this is a big topic online, and there's a lot of backwards and forward, and you got people with doctorate degrees are doing the research now, and they're just not finding the evidence to back up what you're saying, Sister Toni. I'm not being disrespectful.
I understand that,
Finding that.
but where they saying this DNA came from?
No, the DNA in the research that they are doing, they're saying the people in the bones they are finding in America come from an Asian abstract.
What do you think Africa was? What do you think Africa was?
I'm a little confused.
And there are two entryways into the country. The Atlantic Ocean is just, associated with the transatlantic. But you had the what is the Bering Strait that allowed them to walk
the Bering Strait
across out of Asia. Yeah.
To Alaska.
Yeah.
Africa was just Upper Asia and Lower Asia. Look at how they connected and go and see who the early, what we call Asiatic people, because Africans are still called Asiatic people, and see the Black Asiatic people before the people we know today as Vietnamese, Chinese, and all of those.
Yeah, those ancient,
those people
some darker skin too.
Also.
Right.
Yeah.
Like the old martial artists. Jesus Christ, I'm trying to think of his name.
Bruce Lee?
Not Bruce Lee, but just the study of ninjas and of that ancient tradition. A lot of that came from people of color, as they're illustrated in terms of their art. So,
yeah,
culturally.
Yes.
Africa is a European name. Asia is a European name. But Asia, Turkey, all of those countries was once a part of Africa.
True. Yeah.
See, I think they kind of forgetting that.
No, I think
Iran, all of that at one time was part of Africa.
Yeah, it's the thinking of the terms of like how I look at things. I look at the fact that we are all from Africa in some type of way, and I can say that it will always end that way, regardless of where we're from. I feel like until we understand better, that's your approach. I definitely don't have any traces of my family that's going back to Africa that I have found, but I am black, but black of America in a way that most of us were originally.
Wait, Josh. I know we're about to close out. So you're telling me you don't have no African DNA within your bloodline?
I do in terms of what the DNA say. In terms of my research, no. Genealogy, no.
See what you're saying, and I'm not. That I hear that constantly in these particular wars on Instagram, and some of it is on YouTube also. But
it shouldn't be a war, though. I don't know how people see it as a war.
It's becoming a war because the people that's standing on indigenous American who's saying they're not African, and they doing DNA tests, and they coming back with 80 and 90% African blood. And they still don't want to acknowledge that. And that is causing the rift. I'm not saying you in particular. I'm just looking at some of the other people online who are doing this. But I know we have to close out, Sister Toni.
Yeah, I see it as a human, like it's a human footprint that's ancient. You have ancient blood. And ancient blood, you can't really, how can I say, I'm looking for the words. You can't walk in that in a arrogant manner. You can't walk in it in a egotistical manner. It's something that's a part of you that you have to adapt to and understand and be willing to open your mind to. And most people, they look at it as, oh, I mean, we have a mindset, a racist mindset that we've been studied and traditioned into. And I think that once we understand that how beautiful we are in terms of shades and colors and different perspectives, we're a world people. And we've always been a world people, and we always will be. And yeah, that's the way I see it.
Yeah, I respect that. I respect that. Sister Toni, you close us out.
Yeah, we're out of time, and I'm so glad everyone came. I'm enjoying this discussion. Divine Prince can close us out with the International Voodoo Day acknowledgement that he always does at the end of the broadcast.
Ashe.
Sure.
Please continue to support us, join us, consult with us, donate, and sponsor us at www.vodouday.org, www.voodooday.org. There is a contact button there. You can send us an email directly through the website as it relates to your participation and or involvement in our third annual International New Orleans Voodoo Day. It continues to grow in leaps and bounds with each year, and we certainly invite you to come on board now while there's time. We enjoyed tonight, and we look to continue this conversation on tomorrow at 9 p.m. U.S. Central Standard Time. All is a blessing, and no matter what you do, respect the voodoo.
Ashe. Good night, everyone.